We've all been there, staring at our phone, wondering why someone we care about suddenly backed away, pulled back, or went silent for a few days right after things were going well. And it's confusing, right? You start judging yourself, doubting the connection, asking, did I do something wrong? But here's something you need to understand. Not everyone shows love in the same way. Some people have an avoidant attachment style. They didn't grow up learning that closeness is safe. To them, intimacy triggers fear. And so when they start to actually care, their instincts tell them to step back. Because to them, closeness doesn't feel natural. It feels dangerous. So when you notice them suddenly taking some space or hesitating to open up, it doesn't always mean they don't love you. Sometimes it means the exact opposite. They're overwhelmed by how much they actually feel, and they're trying to process it. It's uncomfortable for them, and the truth is, it takes a lot of courage to love when your body is wired for distance. That doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect or endless inconsistency. What it does mean is that you don't jump to the conclusion that you're unlovable or that the relationship is doomed. You let them breathe. You recognize that emotional intimacy might take them longer to embrace, but when they do, it's incredibly genuine. Their love isn't loud, it's not overly expressive, it's quiet. It shows in small actions. When they do something practical for you, remember a tiny detail, or show up in a crisis. That's love for an avoidant. When they test the waters by sharing something personal, when they make small efforts to spend time with you even though part of them wants to run, that's huge. Because for them, the safest thing has always been to stay distant. You've got to remember, their temporary pullback doesn't mean rejection. Sometimes it's self-protection. And when you can understand that, you stop personalizing their behavior, you remain calm, you give space without resentment. And in doing so, you actually create safety. That safety is what helps them come back. Not because you chased, but because you stayed grounded. So the next time someone with an avoidant attachment style acts different, don't automatically assume the worst. Watch instead for the subtle signs of care. Recognize that real love can look confusing, especially in someone who had to survive by shutting down their feelings. And if you're the one who's avoidant, understand that the reason you feel scared is because this matters. You love them. Let that be the reason you lean in, even when your mind wants to run. Love isn't supposed to feel perfectly safe at first. It's supposed to grow stronger when you learn to stay. Avoidant behavior can be one of the most confusing things to interpret, especially when you deeply care about someone and you've been seeing steady signs of connection. One day they're laughing with you, sharing stories and opening up. And the next day, they seem emotionally distant or suddenly busy. It feels like something went wrong. In reality, people with an avoidant attachment style often become triggered not by negativity, but by the intensity of positive emotions. When they begin to genuinely care, it activates a learned internal response that tells them closeness is unsafe. Their nervous system associates intimacy with vulnerability and vulnerability with potential pain. So the moment they start feeling connected to someone, the alarm bells go off and they instinctively try to protect themselves by creating space. It's not because they don't feel anything. It's because they feel too much. Their withdrawal is often misunderstood as indifference, when in truth it is a defense mechanism that was built a long time ago, usually in childhood, to survive emotional unpredictability or disappointment. When you observe their pullback, it's important to remember that this is not a reflection of your worth or the value they place on the relationship. It is often a sign that their emotional system has been overwhelmed by the depth of their feelings. They may cancel plans, take longer to reply to messages, or become less verbally affectionate. These behaviors feel personal when you're on the receiving end, but they're actually the avoidance attempt to regain emotional regulation. Unlike secure individuals, avoidants do not feel energized by closeness. They feel threatened by it. Their instinct is to retreat so they can regain a sense of internal balance. When they go silent, they're not necessarily losing interest. They're trying to figure out how to stay in the relationship without losing themselves. That internal conflict is exhausting for them, and at times the only way they know how to cope is to temporarily disconnect. This doesn't mean you should excuse hurtful behavior or lower your standards. It simply means you need to understand the why behind their actions so that you don't automatically jump to self-blame. Their silence or distance might actually indicate that their feelings for you have deepened to a point where it frightens them. This is why you'll often notice that avoidant people seem most comfortable in the early stages of a relationship when everything feels light. But as soon as a real bond starts to form, they may subconsciously sabotage that intimacy to reduce their emotional discomfort. As contradictory as it sounds, the more they care, the more likely they are to pull away. Not to leave, but to protect their heart. Understanding this piece can completely shift the way you respond. Instead of panicking or chasing, you remain grounded and secure in your own emotional space. That grounded energy doesn't push them further away. It helps them feel safe enough to gently move back toward you when they have regulated their emotions. Pullbacks are one of the most misunderstood behaviors in relationships, especially when dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. Most people automatically interpret distance as disinterest or rejection, so when an avoidant suddenly becomes less responsive or breaks their usual pattern of engagement, It can trigger a wave of anxiety and self-doubt. You start analyzing every interaction, wondering which word or action pushed them away. But the truth is, many avoidants are not reacting to something you did at all. They're reacting to what they feel. As their emotional involvement increases, so does their internal discomfort. For someone who learned that vulnerability leads to disappointment or pain, the experience of growing closer can feel emotionally threatening. So they create space not to reject the connection, but to regulate the intensity of their own feelings. This is why it's so important not to jump to extreme conclusions during those pullback phases. Instead of assuming you are no longer valued or cared for, recognize that a pullback can actually be a sign that the relationship is starting to matter more to them than they expected. Many avoidants never had the safety to sit with complicated emotions. So when a relationship becomes emotionally meaningful, their instinct tells them to retreat in order to protect themselves. That retreat isn't a deliberate choice to hurt you or manipulate you. It's a reflexive attempt to reduce overwhelming internal pressure. They don't need you to fix anything in that moment. They need space to process what they're feeling so they can eventually re-engage in a more grounded way. When you personalize their distancing behavior, you add unnecessary tension to the relationship. You might begin over-explaining, texting excessively, or demanding reassurance. This kind of anxious reaction often reinforces their fear and causes them to withdraw even more. The healthiest thing you can do is understand that their pullback is rarely about a lack of love. It is more often an indication that their emotions are deeper than they can safely handle in that moment. By giving them the breathing room they subconsciously need, you are actually supporting the relationship and showing that you respect their emotional pace. Over time, what allows an avoidant to feel secure is not constant closeness, but the knowledge that they can step back without the relationship collapsing. This creates a safe dynamic where they don't feel pressured or chased, and ironically, that safety helps them return more quickly and more consistently. A pullback doesn't mean they don't care. It simply means they're recalibrating. When they reappear and initiate connection again, it's not a random act. It's a sign that they've worked through some of that internal resistance and made a conscious choice to lean back in. Seeing their distance through this lens not only reduces your anxiety, but also strengthens the foundation of the connection by promoting mutual understanding and emotional maturity. Love expressed by someone with an avoidant attachment style doesn't always resemble the storybook version of romance we often expect. Instead of grand gestures or constant verbal affirmations, their affection tends to show up in subtle, practical, and often easily overlooked ways. This can be confusing if you're someone who associates love with emotional closeness and verbal validation. But for an avoidant, emotional exposure can feel intensely uncomfortable, so they often communicate care through action rather than words. They might not say, "I love you," often, but they'll notice when your car needs servicing and take care of it. They may not initiate deep heart-to-heart conversations, but they'll remember your favorite snack and bring it to you when you've had a long day. These small gestures are not random. They're intentional acts of connection that feel safer for them than open emotional expression. People with avoidant tendencies often value independence and self-sufficiency. So when they make room for you in their routines or involve you in their life decisions, that is actually a powerful indicator of how much they care. For them, to consider someone else's needs alongside their own is a significant step. They may plan ahead to accommodate you, help you solve practical problems, or step up in times of crisis without making a big deal about it. These expressions of love might be quiet, but they are genuine. The challenge is that if you're only looking for verbal reassurance, you might miss the very real ways they're showing up. You might interpret their quietness as a lack of emotional investment, when in reality they're investing in ways that feel comfortable and safe to them. Understanding their love language requires you to pay attention to patterns instead of words. For example, if they consistently show up when something goes wrong, that's a major sign of loyalty and care. If they remember tiny details you once mentioned and act on them later, that means they're paying attention even when they seem distant. They may not want to engage in constant conversation, but they might run errands with you or fix something around your house without being asked. These might seem like small things, but for an avoidant, they are powerful ways of saying, "I care for you. I want to help. I'm here." It's important not to dismiss these gestures just because they don't match your personal expectations of love. Every individual expresses affection based on their emotional wiring and life experience. The key is to shift your focus from what they are not doing to what they are doing. When you start recognizing their subtle expressions of love, you'll realize they can be incredibly thoughtful and reliable partners. That doesn't mean you suppress your own needs. It just means you learn to appreciate their authentic way of loving while communicating what matters to you. When you meet them with understanding and gratitude for those small acts, it often encourages them to open up even more over time. Giving space without resentment is one of the most powerful things you can do when you're in a connection with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. When their instinct tells them to back away, it's not because they want to end the relationship. It's because they need to regain emotional equilibrium. Many people respond to that distance with panic, trying to pull the avoidant person closer by demanding answers, over-communicating, or sending repetitive messages in hopes of reassurance. Unfortunately, that kind of reaction often has the opposite effect. It overwhelms them even more and reinforces their belief that closeness is unsafe. What actually creates emotional safety for an avoidant is knowing that they are free to step back without being criticized, guilt-tripped, or abandoned. When you can hold space calmly without turning their need for distance into a personal attack, you're sending a powerful message. You don't have to perform or pretend in order for me to stay connected to you. That kind of emotional maturity builds trust over time. It tells the avoidant person that the relationship can withstand temporary distance, and that intimacy doesn't always have to mean constant proximity. You remain steady and secure in yourself, which gives them the emotional breathing room they need to process their feelings. In that space, they're able to self-regulate and eventually return to the relationship more open and grounded. They begin to associate closeness with safety rather than pressure. Ironically, the more space you allow without resentment, the more naturally they gravitate back toward you. Not because you pushed them, but because you respected their internal rhythm. It's also important to be mindful of your internal reaction during these moments. Giving space doesn't mean silently suffering or pretending you don't care. It means acknowledging your own feelings of discomfort while still choosing not to act out of fear. Instead of reacting impulsively, you pause. You remind yourself that their need for space is not a statement about your worth, but a reflection of their internal processing style. In other words, you regulate yourself first. That kind of emotional self-control is not easy, but it creates an environment where real connection can grow. Every time you resist the urge to chase, you reinforce a healthier relational pattern, one where both people can honor their emotional needs without triggering each other's defenses. Over time, this dynamic creates depth. The avoidant person begins to feel less threatened by their own feelings, because they see that you can handle their emotional ups and downs without judgment. And as their trust grows, so does their ability to stay present rather than retreat. The more consistently you demonstrate calmness and respect for their boundaries, the more they internalize the belief that intimacy does not require self-abandonment. Eventually, this safety becomes the bridge that allows them to transition from fear-based distancing to genuine emotional availability. Recognizing the difference between disrespect and fear-driven distance is absolutely essential if you want to stay grounded and emotionally healthy in a relationship with an avoidant partner. When someone pulls away because they are overwhelmed by their own feelings, their behavior may look similar to someone who simply doesn't value you. But the intention behind it is very different. Disrespect involves thoughtless behavior, a lack of consideration, or a disregard for your emotional well-being. Fear-driven distance, on the other hand, stems from an internal struggle that has little to do with you personally and everything to do with their own protective wiring. Your ability to distinguish between the two allows you to respond with clarity rather than reacting out of insecurity. If you immediately assume that any distance equals disrespect, you might end up setting unnecessary ultimatums or interpreting their fear as a sign that you should walk away. However, when you recognize that the emotional withdrawal is rooted in vulnerability, you can hold a healthy boundary while still remaining open to connection. This kind of discernment requires self-awareness and emotional intelligence. It means paying attention not only to what they do, but also how they do it and whether there is consistency in the deeper pattern. For example, a person who is disrespectful will often dismiss your feelings, ignore your needs, or make you feel unimportant, regardless of whether they are close or distant. Someone who is avoidant, however, may temporarily step back, but when they are present, they show up in meaningful ways. They still remember important details, still follow through on commitments, and still show genuine care in their actions even if their words are few. Their fear might cause periods of silence, but you will notice that they eventually return and try to re-engage in the relationship, because the connection matters to them. That pattern of pulling back and then returning can be a key indicator that it's fear, not disrespect. At the same time, recognizing fear-driven distance does not mean excusing consistent behavior that hurts you. There is a big difference between having compassion and abandoning your own needs. The goal is not to tolerate emotional inconsistency indefinitely. The goal is to become conscious of why it's happening so that you can respond appropriately. If their fear-based distancing actually softens over time and the relationship becomes more stable as trust builds, that's a sign of growth. But if the distancing becomes more frequent, more extreme, or is accompanied by emotional neglect, then it may not be fear. It may be a lack of respect or emotional readiness. In that case, your responsibility is to protect your own well-being and set boundaries. By understanding this distinction, you become empowered. You stop taking their behavior at face value and start interpreting it through a more accurate emotional lens. This allows you to stay calm, choose thoughtful responses, and maintain your self-worth regardless of their internal process. Ultimately, being able to recognize the difference between fear-driven distance and disrespect helps you build healthier relationships, because you're no longer reacting to assumptions but responding to reality. In the end, understanding the way an avoidant expresses love allows you to approach the relationship from a place of compassion instead of insecurity. When you can recognize the difference between fear and disinterest, you'll stop assuming the worst and start responding with patience, clarity, and self-respect. And that creates the kind of safety where real love can grow. Thank you for listening, and I truly hope these insights help you build stronger, healthier connections moving forward.